Faith is more than just belief. It is the very essence of how we relate to God, shaping not only our actions but our entire existence. In our last video, we explored the depths of faith, uncovering its power and significance in ways many overlook. But faith is not just one-dimensional. It is not a passive thought or a fleeting feeling. It is the very lifeline of the believer, setting us apart from the world and anchoring us in a reality that only those who truly walk with God can understand. In this message, we take a deeper step into the uniqueness of faith, what makes it unlike anything else in our spiritual journey. We will unlock two essential aspects that define faith's role in our lives. First, we will explore how faith is the foundation of a life set apart for God, the very structure upon which all righteous living is built. Without faith, it is impossible to truly walk in alignment with Him. Every act of obedience, every step toward righteousness, is rooted in a trust that sees beyond the physical and rests in God's unshakable truth. Then we will uncover faith's active power, the key that allows us to step into everything God has spoken over us. Many hear God's promises, but few actually walk in them. Why? Because faith is not just knowing what God has said, it is the bridge that brings those promises into reality. We will learn how faith is the doorway through which we claim, experience, and live in the fullness of what God has already prepared for us. This is more than just another teaching on faith. This is an invitation to see faith as the defining mark of those who belong to God, the force that not only shapes our inner life but also determines what we walk in and experience from Him. Let's step into this together, and as we do, may we come to understand what makes faith truly unique, unlike anything else in this world. In our last discussion, we uncovered many layers of faith, its nature, its power, and how it transforms the way we walk with God. But there is something even deeper that we need to grasp. Faith is not just a part of righteous living, it is the very foundation of it. From the beginning of time, God has always required one thing from those who follow Him: faithful trust in Him above all else. Before laws, before rituals, before any system of works, faith stood as the one defining factor that separated those who truly belonged to God. It was faith that made Abel's offering acceptable, faith that set Noah apart in a corrupt world, and faith that caused Abraham to leave everything familiar and follow God's voice into the unknown. Every truly righteous life has always begun and remained in faith. But why is this so? Why is faith the starting point for a life of righteousness? It's because righteousness is not something we create. It is something God grants. And the only way to receive what God gives is by trusting Him completely. This is why Scripture tells us that the righteous shall live by faith. Righteousness is not about following rules to earn God's approval. It is about trusting Him enough to walk in the path He has set before us, knowing that He alone defines what is right and just. Even in the time of the law, faith remained at the center. The people of Israel had commandments to follow, but without faith, those commandments became empty rituals. This was the mistake of the Pharisees. They pursued righteousness by their own efforts, rather than by trusting in God's way. But God has never been looking for outward perfection. He has always been looking for hearts that trust Him. Faith is what turns obedience from a burdensome duty into an act of love and devotion. When we truly understand this, we stop striving for righteousness in our own strength. We stop trying to earn God's favor through human effort and begin to walk in the righteousness He provides. This is why faith is unique. It does not just bring us into salvation, it sustains us in a life that is pleasing to God. It keeps us from relying on ourselves and keeps our hearts anchored in Him. Without faith, even the best efforts are meaningless. But with faith, our lives become a reflection of God's righteousness, not because we are perfect, but because we trust in the One who is. This is why faith is not just important, it is the very foundation of a life set apart for Him. If faith is the foundation of a righteous life, then it is also the bridge that leads us into everything God has spoken over us. Many believers know God's promises. They read them in Scripture, they hear them preached, but few actually walk in them. Why? Because God's promises are not just words to admire, they are realities to step into. and the only way to step into them is through faith. All throughout Scripture we see a pattern. God speaks a promise, but faith is required to take hold of it. When God told Abraham that he would be the father of many nations, the promise did not come instantly. He had to believe even when everything in the natural world seemed to contradict what God had said. When Israel was given the promised land, they did not receive it just because God declared it theirs. They had to move forward in faith, step onto the land, and claim what had already been spoken. The same is true for us today. God's promises cover every area of our lives: His provision, His peace, His guidance, His strength. But they do not automatically manifest just because we know about them. Many Christians live beneath the fullness of what God has for them simply because they never truly grasped those promises in faith. It is not enough to hear them, to read them, or even to desire them. Faith requires action. Faith steps forward even when circumstances look uncertain. Faith holds on to what God has said, even when reality seems to say otherwise. One of the greatest misunderstandings about faith is that it is passive, simply waiting for God to move. But faith is never passive. It is an active trust, a confident pursuit of what God has already made available. This is why Jesus repeatedly said, "Your faith has made you whole." The healing was always in God's power, but it was faith that positioned people to receive it. Faith is what moves us from knowing God's promises to living in them. But there is something even deeper. Faith does not just bring us into God's promises, it keeps us there. Many step into a promise but struggle to remain in it because doubt, fear, and trials test their faith. Just like Peter walking on water, his faith allowed him to step into the miraculous, but when doubt crept in, he began to sink. This is why faith must be cultivated, strengthened, and renewed daily. We do not just have faith once, we live by faith continually. So as we come to the end of this message, let's ask ourselves, are we merely hearing God's promises, or are we actively walking in them? Faith is not just believing in the possibility of God's promises, it is knowing they are already ours and stepping into them boldly. And as we grow in this walk of faith, may we never forget that every promise of God finds its fulfillment when we trust Him completely. Because faith is not just about receiving, it is about living. And in that, we always find our way back to God's love.